Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We are, if the schedule is to be believed, about 13 hours from a vote in the Judiciary Committee of the Senate, United States, about whether to put Brett Kavanaugh on the nation's highest court for life. A vote on that, I would imagine, seems inconceivable to millions of Americans that watched what happened today. A spectacle that was at times enraging, galling, baffling, inspiring, and wrenching. Something that we have not seen in probably a generation. Americans around the country huddled in bars early in the morning and around cell phones as they walked down the streets, sneaking into closets in the office or just watching at their desks, rapt and paying attention to two people before this committee at this moment, at this profound moment of cultural disruption around power and around men and around women. Today, for the first time, the nation got to meet Dr. Blasey Ford. That is the woman who says that when she was 15 years old, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, as a high school student, sexually assaulted her in a room with his friend Mark Judge. She was there before the committee with 11 men from the GOP on one side, but she did not face questions from them. They instead had outsourced their questioning to Rachel Mitchell, who is a sex crimes prosecutor from Arizona, and a woman, a female assistant, in the words of Mitch McConnell. This woman who came forward with her story was someone evidently reluctant, both in the reporting and in her presentation today, to tell what happened to her, evidently traumatized by what happened to her. And the story she told was remarkable and affecting, and I think traumatizing deeply for the millions of Americans who watched, who have also experienced the same. She began by talking about how terrified she was.
I am here today not because I want to be. I am terrified. I am here because I believe it is my civic duty to tell you what happened to me while Brett Kavanaugh and I were in high school.
The allegation that she makes against Brett Kavanaugh that had circulated first in an anonymous letter that had been sent to her member of Congress, then on to Senator Dianne Feinstein, a tip that she had called into the Washington Post, all in her testimony in a frenetic attempt to forestall the White House and Donald Trump and Senate Republicans from choosing Brett Kavanaugh from a short list of judges for the Supreme Court, knowing and having lived, she says, with the secret inside her of what he had done to her 36 years ago. A frenetic attempt that did not make its way to the White House until it was too late, until the threads came loose and she had reporters standing outside her office, and that, she says, convinced her to come forward. And so today, in front of millions of people, indelibly, in front of the cameras, recorded for posterity, in an act that will irrevocably change her life, an act she knew would irrevocably change her life, she came before the committee and under oath, she told what happened to her.
Early in the evening, I went up a very narrow set of stairs leading from the living room to a second floor to use the restroom. When I got to the top of the stairs, I was pushed from behind into a bedroom across from the bathroom. I couldn't see who pushed me. Brett and Mark came into the bedroom and locked the door behind them. There was music playing in the bedroom. It was turned up louder by either Brett or Mark once we were in the room. I was pushed onto the bed, and Brett got on top of me. He began running his hands over my body and grinding into me. I yelled, hoping that someone downstairs might hear me, and I tried to get away from him, but his weight was heavy. Brett groped me and tried to take off my clothes. He had a hard time because he was very inebriated and because I was wearing a one-piece bathing suit underneath my clothing. I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. When I did, Brett put his hand over my mouth to stop me from yelling. This is what terrified me the most and has had the most lasting impact on my life. It was hard for me to breathe, and I thought that Brett was accidentally going to kill me.
Dr. Ford, who is a scientist who does research on the brain and how it reacts to trauma, was very clear and precise about what she did and did not remember. She was accommodating and searching to help the members of the committee. She was reluctant And she listened to what people had to say. She tried her best in every moment, in her body language, her posture, and her tone of voice, to be accommodating. She also was asked what were the things that she remembered most clearly, this trauma that she says had seared itself into her brain. She was asked what stood out the most.
What is the strongest memory you have? Strongest memory of the incident, something that you cannot forget. Take whatever time you need.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two, and they're having fun at my expense.
And then she was asked, was she certain?
How are you so sure that it was he?
The same way that I'm sure that I'm talking to you right now. It's just basic memory functions.
Dr. Ford, with what degree of certainty do you believe Brett Kavanaugh assaulted you?
100%.
We cannot know for certain, I certainly cannot, what happened in that room, if it happened, if she's telling the truth, if she is recalling properly. It was extremely difficult for anyone watching that to think it was concocted or a performance. She did everything that was asked of her before that committee, and the GOP senators, all men, sat there and they watched her as she was essentially cross-examined by a woman who was paid by them or hired by them or brought on by them to poke holes in her story. And then they recessed, and then it was time for Judge Kavanaugh, a man who is facing a possible lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court, a man who says he's been eager to testify. And he came with a very different approach. He sat before the committee clearly furious, a man who feels that he was wronged, who strongly denies what happened. And he sat there before that same committee. And in a contrast as stark as night and day, he let them have it.
This confirmation process has become a national disgrace. The Constitution gives the Senate an important role in the confirmation process, but you have replaced advice and consent with search and destroy. Since my nomination in July, there's been a frenzy on the left to come up with something, anything, to block my confirmation. This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. This is a circus. Let's turn to specifics. I categorically and unequivocally deny the allegation against me by Dr. Ford. I never had any sexual or physical encounter of any kind with Dr. Ford. I never attended a gathering like the one Dr. Ford describes in her allegation. I've never sexually assaulted Dr. Ford or anyone.
For more on what happened today and where Kavanaugh's nomination stands, I'm joined by Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. Senator, reaction to what you saw today?
Well, I thought Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony was incredible. I thought she was so heartfelt. She spoke her truth so passionately, with such candor, with such emotion. I was really inspired by what she did today. I thought the second half, though, was so discouraging. I thought the way Judge Kavanaugh started with partisan attacks, it really made me question his fitness for this office, for the fact that he does not have the temperament or the character or the honesty or integrity to be a Supreme Court justice. I was really disturbed by the second half of the hearing and disturbed by my Republican colleagues and how they acted and what they said.
That opening by Judge Kavanaugh, have you ever seen a nominee for judicial position, particularly Supreme Court nominee, speak in that kind of way, using language like borking, talking about a kind of Clinton conspiracy, etc.?
I've never heard about it, and I could never even imagined it. And it really makes me question his absolute unfitness for this nomination. I cannot understand how he could turn something so important as this hearing into finding out the facts of a credible accusation of sexual assault into some kind of political hit. And the way he talked, he was so arrogant in how he spoke to senators and dismissive. I was really offended by how he behaved at the hearing.
There was a strange format in which a woman had been brought in, a prosecutor was brought in to cross-examine, essentially, the woman Dr. Ford, who's making this allegation. She started to ask sort of similarly kind of pointed procedural and prosecutorial questions of Judge Kavanaugh, and then was stopped, and then the Republicans took the gavel back and asked the questions the rest of the way. What did you think about that?
Well, I thought her role in the first place was highly concerning. The fact that they asked a prosecutor to ask questions of Dr. Blasey Ford as if she's on trial. She's not on trial. She was bringing forth credible allegations that this committee needed to assess and then look at Judge Kavanaugh and assess his credibility. And then the fact that she starts to question Judge Kavanaugh and then is cut off by the Republican senators and dismissed. I mean, it really wasn't fair, and it just goes to the heart that this hearing was never set up to be fair. It was never set up to get to the bottom of it. The fact that, again, Judge Kavanaugh could not answer the question. 5 Democratic senators asked him, will you ask for an FBI investigation? And he could not say yes, not once. He continued to obfuscate, to pivot to different issues, to filibuster and talk about things that was not being asked about. I just thought his behavior and the content of his testimony was absolutely inappropriate.
Do you think he was lying?
Yes, I think he lied several times. The fact that he kept saying, oh, yeah, I love beer, I mean, honestly, and then couldn't possibly say, no, there was no evening when I drank so much I didn't remember, even though he made jokes about it when he took his road trip with his buddies to watch the baseball game. I mean, it's really shocking to me that he could be so direct in not telling the truth about his drinking and how it affected him.
Do you think he was lying about the core substance of the allegation? Dr. Blasey Ford said he assaulted her.
I do.
He said he's innocent. You think he remembers that night and is lying about it?
I believe Dr. Blasey Ford, and I believed her testimony. I think she spoke from the heart as someone who was reliving the worst moment of her life. You could see it on her face. This was something that was traumatic, deeply troubling for her whole life. She told the truth, and that was very clear. And I don't see how possibly what he said could possibly be truthful given what she said. So I think he wasn't telling the truth, and I don't believe him.
You know, we're at a moment, obviously, in the country, this sort of profound reckoning and awakening around questions of patriarchy, sexism, gender inequities. What was today? What was the spectacle today that all of those men on the Republican side of that dais, Brett Kavanaugh, Dr. Blasey Ford, what message did it send?
Well, in some ways, it was a tragic day for America, because to have those Republican senators disregard Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony, to have them speak as if she didn't just tell them what happened so honestly, and so forthrightly, and then to try to turn this hearing into a spectacle and accuse Democrats of being partisan and that this is some conspiracy. I mean, it was shocking to me, and I think for a lot of women in this country, particularly for survivors, it was a really low moment. I think a lot of women are suffering and feel that this country does not have their back, that in fact these Republican senators are disregarding them, disregarding their truth, disregarding their value and their voices by how they behaved and by how they treated Judge Kavanaugh, and as if he is the victim here. He is not the victim here. He is someone who is hoping to be able to serve on the Supreme Court in a lifetime appointment. He is being given an extraordinary opportunity, and he showed so little humility and so little gratitude for the opportunity he's been given. And he turned this entire hearing into a sad story about himself, that he is somehow the victim here. That is not the case. And I just want to say that to Dr. Blasey Ford, her courage, I mean, she's the hero, and she's the one who spoke truth to power in a powerful way and in a truthful way that I think inspired people across this country. It's a tough day.
Yeah, I think that's inarguable. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Joining me now, one of the Democratic senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thank you so much for making time after what was an extremely long day. What was that hearing?
That's a great question, Chris. That hearing was not what the American people deserve today. I did think Dr. Ford came forward and gave compelling and powerful testimony. I do think we should have had more than 2 witnesses in front of us today. It's striking to me, for example, that Mark Judge was not a sworn witness in front of the testimony today. Someone who still has not given a sworn statement to the committee. And so that's why I joined a number of colleagues in saying to both Judge Kavanaugh and to my colleagues, we should be pausing for a week and having the nonpartisan FBI investigate a number of these troubling allegations. I was encouraged, frankly, that although the Republicans hired a prosecutor to do their questioning for them, that Dr. Ford was able to get out most of her story. And I experienced today something really striking, Chris, in that during her testimony, several people I know, several women I know from Delaware reached out to me to share their stories of surviving sexual assault. So I know, if nothing else was accomplished today, that Dr. Ford, 27 years after the hearing where Professor Anita Hill was really put on trial, she was able to tell her story, and it inspired and encouraged survivors all over this country to know that they can come forward and share their stories too.
Brett Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh, did you find him credible? Do you think he was truthful and forthright with the committee?
There's a number of areas where I have concerns about his credibility, from specific issues around his stories about his drinking habits and it being just a few beers here and there, and him being someone who does not become aggressive when drunk and has never forgotten the events of a previous evening. I think there's lots of evidence from his high school and college years that goes against that characterization. To my experience with him in the previous round of the confirmation hearings, where I tried to get him to answer directly my questions based on his speeches, his writings, law review articles, dissents, and I felt like he was evasive and, frankly, on some issues, gave answers that were just not credible. So I have real concerns with his credibility.
His tone was remarkable and a remarkable contrast. I want to ask you about an exchange that happened between Amy Klobuchar, your colleague, and himself, a back and forth precisely on a topic that you asked many questions about his drinking. He said under oath that it was never the case that he drank so much he forgot events from the night before. Never the case. And Senator Klobuchar had some questions for him on drinking. Take a listen to this.
So you're saying there's never been a case where you drank so much that you didn't remember what happened the night before, or part of what happened?
You're asking about, blackout. I don't know. Have you?
Could you answer the question, Judge? That's not happened. Is that your answer?
Yeah, and I'm curious if you have.
I have no drinking problem, Judge.
Yeah, nor do I.
What did you think about that?
Pretty unprecedented. There were quite a few moments in today's hearing that were jaw-dropping. Frankly, my colleague Lindsey Graham launched into an angry screed at one point that was unprecedented in my 8 years here in the Senate. And I thought the opening moments of Judge Kavanaugh's a very lengthy opening statement where he accused the Democrats of a left-wing conspiracy fueled by the desire for revenge by the Clintons was very off-putting and suggested not a very judicial temperament. And that exchange with Senator Klobuchar was very striking.
I should note that he did come back after recess and apologize for that exchange. Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking time tonight.
Thank you, Chris.
I'm joined now by 2 people who are also in that room for the hearing today. The former head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, current president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Nita Gupta, and senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate Magazine, Dahlia Lipwick. Dahlia, you have covered stuff like this before. What was it like in there?
It was like nothing I've ever seen, Chris. It was. I think one thing that you only get if you're in the room is how tiny the room is, and that sound is suddenly, you could barely hear Dr. Blasey Ford. She was fiddling with her mic. She could barely talk. She was being cross-examined very, very quietly by Rachel Mitchell. And then suddenly the second half, when the shouting started, and then it was Judge Kavanaugh, then it was Lindsey Graham, Grassley was shouting. You literally had this sense that if you're a woman and you're the 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 for women in America who are assaulted, and you marshal all your energy and you try to get brave and you talk to therapists and you create a record and you hesitatingly come forward, at the end of the day, when you put it all out there, you're just going to get screamed at. And it was breathtaking in terms of the sort of whiplashy emotion that was going on in that tiny little room.
What did you think, Vanita?
Yeah, no, I felt the same way. I mean, look, Dr. Blasey Ford was specific. She was credible. She was humble. And throughout the day, even Republicans didn't attack her credibility. But when Brett Kavanaugh came into that room, he was belligerent. He was angry. He was accusing the Democrats of conspiracy theories. He was overtly, I mean, the partisan fury in his voice, and then followed by men who had been stone-faced silent during Dr. Blasey Ford's most heart-wrenching testimony that had all of us, unable to hold back tears. They had been stone-faced silent, then going off and sermonizing, apologizing repeatedly to Kavanaugh, suddenly finding their voices and not being afraid of speaking finally to the cameras. I mean, the contrast was just so incredibly stark.
Yeah, to Vanita's point, Dahlia, you know, the whole shtick here, this whole dance that everybody does, and it's actually done, I think, on both sides quite a bit, that when you come before judicial confirmation, you pretend you have no views, right? Like, oh, I just beamed in here from Mars, and now I'd like to be on the Supreme Court, never thought about abortion. I mean, and then that was such a contrast. Brett Kavanaugh comes out and sounds like he's Sean Hannity. He sounded like a Sean Hannity monologue. And you're reminded this is an individual who was on the star team of the Independent Counsel, who was involved with Elian Gonzalez, the Bush recount in Florida, then in the Bush administration. He has been a partisan warrior for most of his adult life. And all of a sudden it was just there on the table.
I mean, it's such a good point, Chris. This is somebody who was an operative of a machine and very much enmeshed with what the Federalist Society was doing, very much enmeshed in trying to confirm Bush judges. Some of the big hiccups in his testimony, even before this started, were when he got caught out in these moments of being kind of a partisan operative, like the Manny Miranda documents. And so then it's funny because I think he did a pretty creditable job in his hearings of trying to say, but no, I've got the temperament and I'm not that guy. And then to just launch into this sort of Alex Jones style, vast moneyed left-wing conspiracy. One wonders how anyone who's a Democrat could ever feel that they could get a fair shake in front of him after today. I don't know.
Vanita, that was my thought too. Like, if you're watching that and you're the National Resources Defense Council or you're Planned Parenthood, which is going to have cases before the Supreme Court that he will sit on, and you watch that monologue, are you going before an open-minded and impartial jurist?
Look, the reality was that our organizations that have scoured his record on his judicial opinions and statements that he had made long before this hearing had expressed concerns and opposition to him as the nominee based on that record, based on his kind of role as a political operative through and through. But I got to tell you, sitting in that room today, I couldn't imagine. It was so disturbing to think of him being on the highest court of the land for a lifetime appointment with the kind of behavior that he demonstrated today. And just being a woman in that room and watching the wrath. I mean, he was pounding his pen, slamming his binder shut, interrupting the female senators. It was just astonishing. And so, does he really have the temperament now to serve on the court? And look, all eyes are on the Republican senators. I mean, we've got a 9:30 a.m. vote tomorrow morning that they are refusing to pull down. And the only person that I saw who looked remotely distraught during Dr. Ford's testimony on the Republican side was Senator Flake. I mean, I saw him listening intently. Yeah. Senator Graham was like rolling his eyes, swiveling in his chair. I mean, those guys could have cared less. They were clear before that they were just going to plow through this hearing. But, and then he gave that cryptic statement in the latter half where nobody actually knows where this has come out. He is on the committee that is set to vote in less than 13 hours. Tomorrow morning. All right.
Vanita Gupta and Dahlia Lithwick, thank you so much for making time after a long day. NBC News has learned that Senate Republicans are finishing a meeting right now, presumably having talked through what happens next. The very latest, let's go to MSNBC's Garrett Haake on Capitol Hill. Garrett, what's the latest?
Well, Chris, Republicans spent about 45 minutes in the Strom Thurmond room down off of Mitch McConnell's suite of offices downstairs, hashing out their options. And from everything we're able to tell, from a Republican perspective, it sounds like they got what they wanted out of this hearing today. Senators on the Judiciary Committee have been coming out saying they do plan to hold this vote tomorrow, although the Chairman Grassley, was very careful to say only that they're having a meeting tomorrow, they're having a meeting tomorrow, they're having a meeting tomorrow, would not go so far as to commit to the vote. But I'm told by one senator in the room that there was a round of applause for Chairman Grassley and for Lindsey Graham and that performance that was just being discussed by your panel. That's the big Republican meeting that happened tonight. There was a second meeting that happened before that I think is potentially more interesting. And if Democrats and opponents of Judge Kavanaugh are going to stop his nomination, it would come out of this meeting. Senators Joe Manchin, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Jeff Flake met privately in Susan Collins' hideaway in the Capitol just after the hearing was over. All four of them are thought to be on the fence about this nomination. All four of them have been playing their cards very close to the vest, particularly Collins and Murkowski, who have gotten enormous pressure from both sides on this vote. I talked to Joe Manchin as they were leaving this meeting. He would only tell me that they didn't discuss the weather. He was very, very careful not to characterize that meeting. But again, two different sets of conversations going on about what happened here today, but it does appear the Republicans are pressing forward with at least this committee vote first thing tomorrow morning, Chris.
All right, MSNBC's Garrett Haake on Capitol Hill. Thank you. I want to bring in Sharon Leifel, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and MSNBC legal analyst Mimi Rocah, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. I want to start with you because you're a former prosecutor about this strange concoction. It was immediately utterly bizarre that this woman was sitting there. It was... you don't see this in Senate hearings. The senators ask questions, and she's there. No one has ever met her or really knows her. I mean, she has a very reputable background. I'm not disparaging her at all, but the setup was strange. She asks sort of cross-examining questions. I mean, she's not really going after her, but they're pointed questions at Dr. Ford. Then Kavanaugh comes in, and she starts doing the same thing, and then Lindsey Graham blows the whole thing up, and he throws the table up, metaphorically. And then the GOP senators just fire her mid-committee. Yep. What was that?
That was no accident. Here's the thing. Look, I was not in favor of Ms. Mitchell being the one to ask questions, but she was there. I, as a former prosecutor, was embarrassed that she, as a professional law enforcement sex crimes prosecutor who has worked with victims, would partake in this sham. But she was there. And you know what? Dr. Ford got her story out. And even with Ms. Mitchell trying to cross-examine her, trying to poke holes in her, trying to show inconsistencies, nothing. Zero. They poked no holes that mattered. I mean, I think the biggest one, midway through was something about, whether she had wanted to fly there or not. I mean, totally inconsequential. Her story came out clear. She remembered the big picture, the important details, didn't know some minor things, but that's, she explained, and we all know it's common sense. That's how human memory works. But when it came time for Kavanaugh to testify, and Mitchell started doing the same thing.
She did.
She actually was asking him fact-based questions, and he was evasive, and he couldn't answer them. And they did not want that to happen. And that is why she got fired on the spot. Because to the extent this was at all a fact-finding exercise, which I think, we've said many times on this show and others that it was pretty much a joke to call it that. But Ms. Mitchell actually added to that a little bit. Now, they were having none of that because he was not doing well with that. Once you got into facts with him, as soon as that started, he couldn't answer the questions, and so it had to get more political.
I will say this. She touched the stove, which was the calendar July 1st. Yep. She said, you got this thing on July 1st. Go to Timmy's for skis with Judge, the person who is in the allegation, and PJ, also who is in the allegation. That's a Thursday in July of the summer at a house with Judge and PJ and Brett Kavanaugh all together drinking. She got there, and that is when the blow-up happened, and she was fired. Have you ever seen anything like what we saw in this hearing today?
No, I have not. I have never seen anything like outsourcing the questioning to someone else. I have seen a nominee decide to take the emotional reins of the hearing